The Pacific War did not begin with land, it began with the absence of it. A pilot could fly forever in the imagination of a recruitment poster, but out beyond Pearl Harbor, beyond the familiar scent of mainland Earth, the world turned to nothing but water and heat haze. The distances were not measured in miles, they were measured in time, fuel, and the sinking feeling of watching a needle fall while the horizon remained an unbroken blue curve. In Europe, men fought for roads, bridges, railheads, things that existed. In the Pacific, men fought first for the right to build anything at all. The ocean was the first enemy. The jungle was the second. Coral was the third, at once a gift and an obstacle. And monsoon rain heavy enough to drown trucks and drown hope was the fourth. Victory would not go to the side with the fastest fighters or the boldest pilots. It would go to the side that could manufacture land fast enough to keep moving. On maps, the Solomon Islands chain looked like a crooked spine thrown across the sea. To aviators in 1942, it looked like the edge of possibility. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, scraped out of kunai grass and mud by Marines, who dug with rifles and bayonets, when shovels ran short, became the stake in the ground that the entire campaign hinged on. But even Henderson was a wound in the earth more than a runway. Men called it cactus, and its surface was not soil so much as a challenge. Mud that clutched at wheels like fingers, coral dust that scoured engines, and shell craters that reopened each time an enemy shell fell or a rainstorm passed. Aircraft did not simply take off on that strip, they escaped it. The lesson came early. Airpower meant nothing without a surface to launch from. And in the Pacific, nature fought back harder than any army. A cleared jungle strip could turn to soup after one afternoon storm. Steel drums filled with gasoline sank into rivers of brown sludge when used as makeshift runway supports. Bulldozers precious as battleships in that theatre bogged down until only winches and swearing could free them. The tropics did not yield gently. They had to be carved open. That was when a simple truth settled over every planner from Pearl Harbor to Washington. If the United States could not build runways faster than Japan could bomb them, the war was already lost. And so two ideas began to converge, ideas born not from sleek aeronautical design bureaus, but from mud, farm roads, and steel mills. The first arrived in stacks-pierced steel planking, sheets punched with rows of oval holes and stiffened ribs. It was not glamorous, it was not aerodynamic. Engineers joked it looked like a cheese grater. But when bolted together and laid over sand, mud, or coral, it did something almost magical. It created instant ground. Men christened it with a dozen nicknames, PSP, Marston Mat, Mudkiller, but aviators spoke its true name in reverence, salvation. The second idea did not come from engineers in white coats. It came from men who had been farmers, quarry hands, and road graders before they ever held a Navy ID. They wore Seabees patches now, not overalls, but they still thought in the language of Earth. Where others saw jagged coral heads and reef shelves pushed up by ancient volcanic rage, they saw something else entirely, potential runway material. They crushed coral, watered it, rolled it, let the equatorial sun bake it, and created a surface that became hard as poured concrete in days, not weeks. It was alchemy, but the recipe was simple. Shatter the island, spread its bones, pack it until it rang like iron when you stomped on it. A strange alliance formed. Steel, born in American mills, shipped across oceans to blanket pieces of Pacific coral that had never known a footprint, let alone a fighter squadron. And on this crude foundation, the United States began to build stepping stones across the Pacific runways that grew like vines. Always forward, always closer to Tokyo. The Japanese did not understand at first. They believed in fortresses. They believed in defending islands to the last man. But while they dug caves and built bunkers meant to last years, Americans landed with bulldozers, rolled out steel like carpet, and within days had fighters taking off from ground that had been jungle that very week. It looked insane, it looked like chaos, but it was method learned on farms and railbeds, on Depression-era WPA road crews, in steel yards and machine shops, The Seabees did not simply construct, they imposed will on wilderness, and the war bent around that will. Pilots in the Solomons wrote home in disbelief about runways appearing where maps still showed trees. Marines joked that if you gave the Seabees 5 minutes and a cigarette, they'd build you a pier to Tokyo. Commanders realized new arithmetic governed the Pacific. Distance plus fuel plus runway equals victory. Lose any one of those, and even the mightiest fighter became driftwood on the tide. This truth would soon shape one of the most audacious missions in aviation history. On a humid April morning in 1943, a group of P-38 Lightnings would skim the waves on a course drawn with a ruler toward the most valuable target of the Pacific War. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor. The planning was brilliant, the flying skill unmatched, the intelligence coup extraordinary. But before any of that mattered, before throttles pushed forward, before props bit into dawn air, something far simpler had to exist. A runway close enough to matter. Not a graded cow pasture, not a muddy clearing. A hardened strip on a stepping stone island wrestled from jungle and coral by men who believed that steel and sweat could conquer distance. Without those improvised airfields, without coral crushed under sun and steel perforated for mud drainage, the intercept geometry would not close. The mission would be suicide or fantasy instead of destiny. And so, in the Pacific, war became a race to build Earth faster than it could be destroyed. A shovel became a weapon. A bulldozer became a battleship. Steel planks became strategy. And a run of coral shining white in the sun became the difference between a fighter returning with empty guns or never returning at all. The Pacific was too large to outfly. So Americans learned to reshape it instead. He was no one the textbooks expected, no West Point pedigree, no engineering degree from MIT or Caltech, no lineage of military inventors behind his name. He had calloused hands, a back bent by seasons, and lungs full of dust from ploughing Kansas soil long before he ever saw a uniform. His name rarely appears in polished war histories, but among the men who built the Pacific runway by runway, they remembered him simply as Collins the farmer, John Henry Collins, son of a wheat and sorghum man from Leon County, a boy who learned early that if you didn't fix your own ground, you didn't eat. In the 1920s, when roads were ruts and rain made fools of farmers, Collins invented a habit that saved his livelihood. He laid scrap metal sheets over mud to move machinery across flooded fields. Neighbors laughed. "You paving Kansas?" He only grinned and said, "Just making the earth behave." Metal on mud, primitive, crude, ugly. But it worked. When the Depression hit, Collins joined a Works Progress Administration road crew. When war followed, he joined the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees. And there, on a jungle airstrip where bulldozers bogged to their axles and Marines cursed knee-deep in muck, Collins saw a familiar scene. The tropics had simply traded places with Kansas spring thaw. Where engineers debated drainage gradients, Collins squinted and muttered, "This is just a field that needs teaching." He scavenged broken oil drums, scrap steel, and discarded shipping sheets. He hammered and torched oval holes to let water squeeze through, to bite into earth like tractor cleats. Then he and a handful of skeptical Seabees laid his crude iron quilt into mud and rolled a truck across it. The truck stayed above the earth. The metal flexed but did not fail. The Marines watching stopped laughing. Word spread. Farmer's Matt holds a deuce and a half. Another test, a fuel truck. It rolled, bounced, but did not sink. When the squadron's first P-39 rattled down that improvised strip and clawed itself airborne, the crew chief looked at Collins as if he'd conjured it out of dirt and stubbornness. He'd built a runway with farm logic, steel on mud, holes for drainage, weight spread like snowshoes. Soon after, Army engineers arrived to inspect the miracle. They fired questions. Collins spit tobacco juice and shrugged. "Ground sinks, metal don't. What's the problem?" But one young lieutenant, a MIT graduate with polished boots and fingernails too clean for the war, understood what he'd just witnessed. He teletyped Pearl Harbor. Pearl teletyped San Diego. San Diego whispered to Washington, And from that whisper came urgency. The army didn't need theory. It needed runways yesterday. Lockheed could build fighters. Grumman could build Hellcats. But without places to land, they were just expensive sculptures. So Washington summoned steel men, machine press designers, and even highway engineers. And in a meeting room that smelled of cigars and urgency, a crude sheet of hole-punched steel traced from Farmer Collins's field trick was placed on a polished mahogany table. "This," a colonel declared, "will win islands." Within months, the United States began stamping pierced steel planking by the mile. They didn't call it genius. They called it logistics, which is simply what genius becomes when it succeeds too often. Factories in Midwest towns worked night shifts, stamping steel mats. Chicago women at press lines replaced farm wives rolling pie dough. Men who once forged wagon parts now punched drainage holes in war metal. The home front, too, was learning how to make the earth behave. In jungle and coral, on beaches hot enough to blister boots, stacks of shiny metal mats appeared, arriving on LSTs beside tanks and crates of sea rations. They were thrown down, locked end to end like barn roofing, hammered with sledgehammers, anchored by sweat and stubbornness. To the untrained eye, it was ugly. To pilots landing with empty fuel tanks and bullet-scarred wings, it was as beautiful as a cathedral, and the Seabees joked in their gravel-voiced way, "God made the islands. We just make 'em useful." But among the men in the know, they whispered something else. Collins did this first. Out on a farm field no one cared about. The Pacific War was still young when an intelligence officer in Guadalcanal pointed at a map and said the name that would change history. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, would be flying a circuit over Bougainville. If American fighters could reach him, if they could ambush him, perhaps justice could fly on steel wings. One pilot asked the only question that mattered. "Do we have a strip forward enough to launch from?" "Yes, barely." A muddy coral swath, hardened by sweat, coral dust, and the farmer's idea turned military gospel. History would know the mission as Operation Vengeance. It would be studied for its navigation, its courage, its precision. But before any P-38 engines roared awake, a Kansas farmer's idea had quietly made the geometry possible. Runways, born of farm mud, war won on steel sheets and coral dust, victory seeded in soil far from any ocean. And Collins, who returned home after the war to plough fields again, would never claim invention, only practicality. Asked once what he thought when he saw Pacific runways made of steel from Kansas furnaces, he just nodded and said, "Ground's ground. You respect it, or you don't get anywhere." The Pacific did not surrender soil easily. It did not bow like Europe's farmland or flatten like North Africa's desert. It fought back. Mud that swallowed bulldozers to the frame, coral that shattered shovels and chewed the teeth off graders, jungle roots thicker than a man's forearm, as if the earth itself refused invasion. The men who built runways there were not gentle men, nor patient. They were Seabees, we build, we fight, and they learned, sweating through uniforms, soaked in diesel and grit, that the Pacific obeyed only two things: steel and coral. Pierced steel planking PSP arrived in bundles. Each sheet 80 pounds of punched metal meant to float atop mud like a ship's hull. It didn't look like much. A soldier once joked it resembled a cheese grater built by angry farmers. But it worked. It worked in places where engineers had sworn aircraft could never land, on palm-littered beaches, on jungled ridges, on volcanic scrap heaps where even crabs refused to dig. They called it magic. The Seabees called it hard labor and sore backs. And when PSP alone wasn't enough, when storms soaked soil into soup or monsoon rivers peeled entire strips away, the second weapon rose from the ocean itself. Coral crushed, burned, rolled, and hammered into runway stone. The first men to try coral cursed it. The dust burned eyes, coated lungs, settled into hair, and turned sweat into paste. But then something miraculous happened when they compacted it. Coral locked, coral fused, coral became stone beneath steel. Where farm soil had taught Collins his lesson, Coral taught the Seabees theirs. They learned to blast reef beds, dredge lagoons, crush coral into powder, and roll it until it sparked white under sun. The tropics gave them their enemy and their building blocks in the same stroke. A marine pilot once stepped off his Wildcat and stared down at the runway, shimmering like bone in sunlight. "What do you call this stuff?" But a Seabee shirt, ragged, cigarette glued to lip, spat coral dust and said, "Victory gravel." They built strips like men racing death, because often they were. On Guadalcanal, planes circled overhead, waiting to land while bulldozers still groaned forward, blades chewing jungle. Pilots watched explosions bloom around graders as Japanese artillery walked shells across clearing sites. Seabees didn't stop. They swung steel into earth until the shells found them or ran out. A diary entry from a machinist's mate on Espiritu Santo captured it. "We build under fire. We lay steel in darkness. Planes land before we finish. We sleep on bulldozers and eat coral dust. And tomorrow we do it again." They were not poets, but reality made poetry. At Bougainville, it rained so hard that boots sank ankle-deep with each step. Crews worked knee-deep in sludge, laying planking across fields where frogs swam and mosquitoes fed like buzzsaws. Yet by dawn, fighters rolled down shining metal and clawed into rain-heavy sky. At Munda, they built a runway in secrecy, hiding every move under coconut fronds, cutting trees so silently that Japanese spotters never realized a fighter strip was being raised under their noses. When the first P-38s thundered skyward, the enemy didn't believe it. A runway had conjured itself out of jungle. At Tarawa, they waded through surf red with blood to hammer planks into sand while snipers cracked shots from palm stumps. A bulldozer operator named Seaman First Class Harold Boone kept pushing forward even after rounds punched through his seat. When Marines begged him to take cover, he shouted over the engine, "You shoot it, you fix it, I'll build the strip." His dozer finished the path. Bombers landed hours later. Men cheered over engines and gunfire. Every mile of steel laid, every yard of coral crushed, shortened the Pacific. And in April 1943, two P-38 Lightnings sat ready on a strip carved from jungle and coral, their noses pointed toward Bougainville and fate. Operation Vengeance did not begin in the sky. It began here, in the roar of graders, the clang of steel mats, the cough of generators in humid night. When intelligence officers plotted the intercept route on a crude island map, one pilot asked the question that could have killed the mission before it began. "Do we have a strip far enough forward?" Someone checked the Seabee log. Someone remembered a strip barely finished, its steel mats still warm from hammer blows, its coral crust still breathing dust. "Yes," they said. "Barely." Barely was enough. Men like Collins and Boone had carved that barely out of jungle, tide, and coral. Out of sweat darker than oil, out of steel heavier than rifles, out of stubbornness older than war. They built not for glory, but necessity. They built because planes needed ground as much as wings. And as the lightnings lifted that morning, steel mats rattling beneath them, one crew chief clapped dirt from his hands and whispered what no history book would later print, "We laid the road that killed Yamamoto." In the Pacific, victory did not just fly. It was hammered into the dirt first. It began not in a cockpit, but in a cramped intelligence hut where maps smelled of mildew and pencils trembled over compass arcs. Rain pattered on tent canvas, mosquitoes whined. Somewhere outside, a generator coughed like an old smoker. Inside, a young lieutenant pinned a paper strip across a map of the Solomon Islands and whispered as if the jungle could hear, "We can catch him if we can reach Bougainville." Him was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, mastermind of Pearl Harbor, architect of the Empire's early triumphs, and the one officer the Japanese could not afford to lose. American codebreakers had cracked the message. His inspection flight plan, his times, his route. Everything rested on one brutally simple question. Could American fighters even get there? The Pacific did not offer second chances. Fuel wasn't just fuel, it was fate. Distance wasn't measured in miles, but in lives. The math sat on the table like a quiet executioner. From the forward strip on Guadalcanal to Bougainville and back, over 400 miles across open ocean. Water darker than night, no landmarks, no room for error, no land bases in between. No carriers close enough, no rescue once you crossed the line. Only one aircraft had the legs for it, the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Even then, only if it could launch from a runway carved far enough forward. And that runway existed only because farmers turned Seabees had punched steel into swamp and beat coral into obedience. An older colonel traced the distance with a calloused thumb, then looked up and whispered, reverent and grim, "The steel boys bought us just enough ocean." Had the strip been 50 miles farther south, impossible. Had it been 6 weeks later, too late. Had the soil refused to hold steel as Collins once feared, hopeless. War sometimes hinges not on genius, but on timing measured in mud and sweat. The planning officers worked like men chiseling destiny. The route would be a knife/low across the sea, skimming wave tops to avoid Japanese radar. The intercept point chosen to the minute, altitude preset, sun position calculated. But none of them forgot what made the table possible, a patch of coral steel earth behind them. A pilot named Tom Lanphier, briefed on the mission, jabbed his finger at the departure field on the map. "Who laid that strip again?" "A Seabee battalion," someone replied, yawning. "And some army engineers, farmers, ditch hands, coal men, dredge boys." Lanphier nodded slowly. "Then they're flying with us." They didn't print that line in newspapers, but every Lightning pilot felt it. The intelligence officer continued, "We fly 8 Lightnings. 4 will execute the intercept. 4 will guard against zeros." Silence. Then, "What's the fuel margin?" A moment's hesitation. A whisper. "Less if weather turns." Someone chuckled nervously. Comforting. But the strip that steel and coral miracle had shortened the math from hopeless to possible. Possible was enough. Night deepened. Lamps cast jittering shadows over maps. Outside, bulldozers still worked someone, always building, always leveling. Even on the eve of history, the Seabees hammered in darkness, driving one last row of mats into mud so heavy fuel trucks wouldn't bog. Inside the hut, an officer scribbled the mission code name on a chalk slate. VENGEANCE, he underlined it once. Then again. Someone murmured, "He doesn't know we're coming." Another voice, quiet. "And without that strip, we wouldn't be." Dawn came not gently, but like a blade, slicing open the goad. Humid, dark. Fighters crouched on the runway like wolves ready to sprint from the pack. Engines idled, exhaust heat shimmered, and propellers flickered like circular saws cutting air into ribbons. Men leaned against the steel planking, feeling the vibration of twin Allison engines through soles and bones. The runway less than a year ago, mangrove swamp and malaria mud, now throbbed like a living artery of war. They walked the line, pilots touching metal skin, ground crew tapping fuel caps, checking guns. Someone whispered a prayer, someone else whispered a curse. Courage in one breath, dread in the next. A corporal stomped on a mat to shift a stubborn corner into place. He spat dirt, wiped sweat, and muttered, "Don't sink on me now." It didn't. An officer approached the pilots. "All right, boys. No radios, except to fire. No turning back. No parachutes. If you bail sharks'll beat the Japanese to you." The men nodded. They knew. One pilot, a farm kid from Nebraska, looked down the steel runway and said, "Hell of a road someone built us." A mechanic grinned beneath grease and fatigue. "We build roads. You make 'em famous." They shook hands. Not firm, steady, quiet, final. Then throttles advanced. Roar swelled into thunder. The steel runway trembled, a river of rivets carrying thousands of tons of force. The P-38s lunged forward, tires rattling over metal holes, steel singing beneath them. Coral dust rose behind like steam from sacred ground. One by one they lifted not into air, but into destiny. As the last lightning clawed skyward, a Seabee leaned on his shovel, watching them vanish north. He didn't salute. He wasn't that kind of soldier. He just nodded once, whispered to the mud beneath his boots. You held. That's all they needed. And behind every gleaming wing cutting toward Bougainville lay a truth that history rarely writes. Before a fighter can reach the sky, someone must conquer the ground. In the Pacific, that someone was often a farmer with steel dust on his hands. Before bullets flew, before vapors crossed that blue silence over Bougainville, the victory had already begun not with a trigger pull, but with the sound of a shovel striking coral and the clang of steel teeth biting mud. History remembers the intercept. The ocean remembers the weight of those lightnings, but only the ground remembers what made it possible. And the ground does not lie. The P-38s flew north in tight discipline, riding the deck so low that spray kissed their bellies. Clouds slid by like curtains pulled across the ocean stage, sunlight cutting angles into steel wings. They flew not like hunters, but like ghosts, silent radios, sealed lips, hearts pounding to the rhythm of twin Allison engines. Behind them, long after propeller thunder faded, the runway crew stood in jungle shade listening to the quiet left behind. There was a superstition among Seabees. When planes took off on a mission, no one talked until the last echo died, as if sound itself might carry fear back to the pilots. So they waited, hats off, sweat running down necks, hands hanging heavy at their sides. Finally, someone exhaled. Now all we can do is hope. Hope? A bulldozer driver grunted. Hope is for church. We gave 'em ground. That's real. In the cockpit of one Lightning, Major Thomas Lanphier steadied his breathing. He watched the ocean blur beneath him, waves whipping by so close he could almost count whitecaps. He glanced once at the fuel gauge needle delicately poised between confidence and doom, then forced his gaze forward. Training told him to think of headings, minutes, altitude. But humanity does not always obey training. He thought of Pearl Harbor, of burning ships and oil-slicked sailors, of a date carved into bone, December 7th, 1941. He whispered into the oxygen mask, not prayer, not revenge, but resolve. We finish what we started. Another pilot broke radio silence only once, voice thin through static. Remember the strip behind us. The boys put us here. We don't waste what they built. Then silence again, as strict as fate. Hours earlier, those Seabees had worked by lantern light tamping, shoring, tightening steel mat that had loosened under last night's rain. They moved like surgeons on battlefield Earth. It was not pride that pushed them. It was responsibility. Pilots trusted wings. The Seabees trusted ground. One had joked while hammering a mat seam, "Funny. They get medals for what they break. We get blisters for what we build." But another answered, quieter, "They fly 6 hours. We build 12. And they need both." Then, without ceremony, they swung hammers harder. When the Lightnings reached the turning point, they rose engines groaning, wings slicing wind climbing to meet destiny. From that altitude they saw Bougainville's spine of jungle and corridor, ridge, thick and ancient as if older than war itself. Below, the winding inlets and mangrove swamps were calm, unstirred by the killing soon to come. At 19,000 feet they saw them, 2 white-painted Mitsubishi G4M bombers Bettys and 6 Zero escorts, cutting a slow, confident line across the sky. Yamamoto's flight. No Imperial Guard on the ground, no battleship beneath, only sky and the men who had risen into it. Lanphier pressed throttle. So did Lieutenant Rex Barber alongside him. A Lightning's dive was not gentle. It was a fall sharpened by intent, gravity turned into weapon. Props screamed, metal strained, the air shattered around them. One moment, ocean glimmered below. The next, the Japanese formation ballooned in the sights like fragile birds unaware of the hawks above. Barber squeezed his triggers. .50 caliber fire tore into aluminum skin, wing root, left engine. The lead Betty lurched, smoke trailing like torn silk. Lanfear swung across, the arc, guns thundering. The bomber shuddered, tilted, flame blossoming beneath its wing. A Japanese crewman glimpsed a silver flash, an American star on wing, then nothing, only sky ripping apart. The plane carrying Yamamoto rolled, dipped nose, descended into the green moor of Bougainville's jungle. On the ground far behind, the Seabees didn't know yet. They only knew the hour. They knew the plan. They knew the time-distance math like farmers know weather instinct in the bones. Then faint, distant, unbelievable engines again. Returning, men shaded their eyes, saw silhouettes. Counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Someone laughed too loud and shaky. Someone else cursed softly. A habit of relief. And then a wiry machinist, covered in grease and coral grit, whispered, "They made it home. God damn, they made it." Another man gripped a PSP plank edge with trembling fingers, as if thanking steel. Only when the lightnings rolled to a halt did anyone speak freely. Ground crew flooded forward, pulling canopies, slapping wings, shouting questions, choking out half-formed prayers and congratulations. Lanfear climbed down, legs weak, face pale, sweat salted like sea foam. A mechanic handed him a canteen without a word. He drank, wiped his mouth, nodded once in silence. Then someone asked the question that would echo across decades. "Did you get him?" Lanfear glanced toward the jungle horizon where smoke no one could see yet still rose in imagination. "Yes," he said simply. "He's down." A roar went up from the line, not triumphant, but heavy, relieved, fierce, not celebration, completion. And behind the cheers, half drowned in engine heat and sunlight and exhaustion, a Seabee leaned on his shovel and murmured, "That's what runways are for." He spat coral dust, adjusted his cap, and called to his crew. "All right, back to it. Mats don't lay themselves." History had shifted. A war's spear point had been guided by steel teeth in mud. Across the Pacific, a tide turned one island, one runway, one farmer's stubborn idea at a time. And no one who stood on that coral steel earth doubted the lesson. Planes win battles, runways win wars. The ocean does not yield land willingly. Where Europe offered fields and roads and centuries-old villages, the Central Pacific offered sand, surf, and silence broken only by gunfire and surfacing bubbles of artillery-stirred coral sediment. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, names that would one day appear on classroom maps as tiny dots, but in 1943 and 1944 they were mountains to climb, made of reef and fire. To fight in the Pacific was to understand a cruel arithmetic. Each island was worthless until you could land planes there. Then it became priceless, and each island hated the very idea of runways. Tarawa was first to teach the blood-soaked lesson. When the Marines stormed Betio in November of 1943, they found the Japanese runway already in place, but its value came only after they had paid for every grain of coral in blood. When the tide betrayed the Higgins boats, and men waded through surf under machine gun storms, Seabees rode in the same waves. Some never made it to shore. Some reached the beach dragging tools instead of rifles. A Marine officer radioed in shock, "They're building an airfield under fire." And they were bulldozers pushing sand while snipers hunted them, cranes clawing through blasted wreckage, men throwing themselves flat when mortars fell, then rising again to drag fuel drums and lay matting. The first aircraft a scout plane landed on that field 76 hours after the battle's start. A historian would later call it logistical insanity turned triumph. A Seabee simply wrote in his notebook, "We build fast. War don't wait." Then came Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, a lagoon of shattered palm trunks and smashed bunkers. When the shooting slowed, a bulldozer rolled forward with a plywood sign wired to its grill. "This machine can kill Japs quicker than you can." It wasn't boasting, it was prophecy. For every crater filled, every palm stump ripped out, every yard of coral compacted, American planes came closer to Tokyo. Kwajalein's sand was soft as flour, tanks sank in it, boots struggled to find grip, trucks groaned and buried their wheels. Engineers studied the soil, wiped sweat, and made the same decision Collins once made on the Kansas plains. Lay steel, lay coral. Make ground where ground refused to be. Men joked that the Seabees didn't just build airstrips, they grew them. Then, in mid-1944, the Pacific War crossed a threshold at Saipan and Tinian. Here the coral was thick as bone and sharp as broken glass. Here the humidity could drown a man slower than bullets, but just as sure. Here Japanese defenders held caves and cliffs, and every step forward was stalked not just by snipers, but by the land itself, uneven, jagged, blister-hot, ancient. Yet within days of Marines securing the southern end of Saipan, Seabees were detonating charges to blast coral, grading crushed reef under the tropical sun, laying PSP over it, and rolling the first runway lines with chalk and prayer. At Tinian they did something even greater. They built the future of warfare. 2 parallel runways stretched across the island like white scars, then 4. Not fighter strips, not tactical fields, but super runways, long enough and strong enough for a new steel giant nobody in the early war had dared to imagine, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. They sprouted from coral in weeks 4 8,000-foot runways where cane fields and jungle once stood. It was not construction, it was conjuring. A Seabee foreman summed it up in 3 words: we outran ingenuity. Workers dropped from exhaustion, woke to hammers, and kept going. Cement mixers churned day and night. Coral dust coated tongues metallic and bitter. Bulldozers glowed under welding arcs. The jungle fell, hilltops flattened, and American heavy bombers soon rolled down white runways like arrows loosed from a bowstring pointed straight at Japan. When the first B-29 lifted from Tinian's coral spine, its wheels hummed over PSP that still smelled of sweat and diesel. The ground crew did not cheer. They exhaled like men who had moved a continent by hand. One pilot, pausing before boarding, knelt and touched the runway with 2 fingers, as if at a grave or altar. Feels like stone. A Seabee wiping oil from his knuckles grinned. That's coral, son. Stone's jealous. Across all these islands, there was a pattern not of land, but of will. Burn the palms, cut the jungle, blast the coral, roll it flat, lay steel, land planes, repeat, no pause, no celebration, no monuments. The only evidence, victory was the echo of engines where once there had been waves. From Tarawa to Kwajalein, Saipan to Tinian, the Pacific became a ladder. Each rung was a runway, and every rung was hammered together by men who never flew but understood flight better than most. Flight begins when wheels roll, and wheels need ground that does not give. When the first B-29 formations launched toward the Japanese home islands, the young Seabee Collins back in Kansas again. Repairing a tractor might have looked across a wheat field and remembered coral and steel, mud and sweat. He may not have known his invention reshaped the Pacific War. Farm dirt, jungle dust, coral crushed to powder. He had simply recognized truth. You master the ground first, or you never touch the sky. And in those months when runways bloomed out of reef and hellfire, the Pacific, once only water and distance, turned into a road. Victory in the Pacific did not look like a charge up a hill or a flag raised on high ground. It looked like crates, it looked like steel, it looked like ships so numerous they darkened the water. The Japanese soldier believed in spirit, in will, in the divine wind. The American bulldozer believed in something else entirely. More metal, more fuel, more hands, more hammers, more mats, stacked like pancakes aboard Liberty ships and Victory ships, and floating docks that rolled across the ocean like mobile cities. War is never fair. Industrial war is cruelty disguised as arithmetic, and the Pacific, unforgiving, endless, merciless, taught the lesson brutally. On Saipan, A private first class named Eddie Moran once counted ships in the horizon because he couldn't sleep from the heat. He stopped at 173. He fell asleep trying to count the rest. In 1944, that was how America spoke, in convoys, in cranes, in engines, in repeating steel and diesel, until even jungle crumbled under the weight of it. Not heroic, not romantic, but unstoppable. A Seabee lieutenant once scribbled, "The Japanese worship their emperor, we worship the supply chain." He wasn't wrong. A Japanese officer in the Marshalls, interrogated post-war, described watching American construction. "We killed bulldozer drivers. The Americans sent 10 more. We shelled your fuel drums. You stacked 100 more. We bombed your runway. You built 2. He paused before the final sentence. "We fought soldiers. You fought mathematics." Behind every runway, there was another one ready to be built, and behind that, another ship bringing more steel, more fuel, more gravel, more machines, more men who knew how to hold a sledgehammer like it was a sermon. Factories in Pittsburgh punched holes in steel matting day and night. Foundries in Indiana poured beams. Corn-fed boys from Iowa learned to drive graders. Louisiana ditch diggers learned to run cranes. The war wasn't won by brilliance alone. It was won by a nation that treated logistics like gospel. A pilot might be a hero. A runway crew chief was a priest. You could replace a plane. You could not fly without ground beneath you. On Guam, a Navy doctor once walked an airstrip site at dawn. Men had worked through the night, bulldozers roaring, hammers ringing, mosquitoes drinking their fill. He expected to find bodies exhausted in mud. Instead, he found men laughing, singing, smoking eyes red, shirts drenched, waiting for the next load of mat. He asked a crew leader, "How long have you been at it?" The answer came without hesitation. "Until it's done." Not 12 hours, not 24, until it's done. That was the tempo. That was the rhythm. They didn't measure time in clocks. They measured it in runway length. When the first B-29s landed at Tinian, the crews marveled at the vast grid of airfields, 4 runways, 8,000 feet each, taxiways wider than entire European strips. It looked unnatural, like geometry had invaded the tropics. A bomber pilot asked a Seabee foreman, "How'd you move that hill?" The man shrugged. "Dynamite, coral, and lunch breaks when we remember." Another asked, "How long did it take?" The answer came with a smirk. "Not long enough for the enemy to stop us." And then came the moment that sealed the truth forever. When the war turned and America went from island hopping to continent hammering, engineers did not slow. They accelerated. Super fortresses needed bigger fuel farms, bigger depots, bigger everything. A planning officer in the Marianas joked, "We're not building airfields anymore, we're building countries." He wasn't exaggerating. The Seabees didn't just lay runways, they laid infrastructure. Piers, hospitals, ammunition dumps, machine shops, refrigeration warehouses, fuel lines stretching like arteries across coral. If an island lacked water, they piped it. If it lacked flat ground, they carved to it. If it lacked purpose, they created one. And every time they finished a strip, someone asked, "How soon can aircraft land?" The answer never changed. When you hear engines. In Japan's war diaries, one phrase appears over and over in 1944 and 1945. American resources are without limit. Not bravery, not genius, resources. It terrified them, because courage can be matched, skill can be matched, strategy can be matched, but systems monstrous, tireless, ever-growing cannot. A Japanese colonel wrote after the war, "We believed spirit could defeat steel. The Americans showed us steel has a spirit of its own. The miracle was not that America had more. The miracle was what it did with more, turned farmers into runway builders, turned steel mills into coral lifelines, turned ships into roads, roads into islands, islands into airfields, and airfields into stepping stones to victory. This was not chance. This was not luck. It was a decision made long before the first shot. Build so much that defeat becomes impossible. Then build more. And in that relentless rising tide of material, sweat, and will, the Pacific War bent and finally broke. The Emperor prayed for a divine wind. The Americans brought bulldozers. And the ocean learned a final lesson. Numbers can wage war, but abundance can win it. Tinian smelled of crushed coral and sweat and aviation fuel. Men said the dust never left your tongue. Even dreams tasted white there. It was an island shaped by nature, but remade by will, and in the summer of 1944 it was the most important construction site in human history. Because Tinian was not just another airfield, it was the anvil on which the air war against Japan would be beaten into its final shape, and the world did not yet know how heavy that hammer would fall. When the Marines first came ashore, Tinian was sugar fields and ridges and machine gun nests, defended stubbornly, and surrendered never. The Japanese held a honeycomb of tunnels beneath the soil. They fought from caves, from trees, from camouflaged holes in the coral itself. To take the island, Americans attacked straight through the thickest cane a wind-worn island could grow, bayonets flashing, flamethrowers belching, and bulldozers crawling forward behind tanks like beasts that had grown steel plates in place of hides. But what came after the gunfire was stranger and quieter, yet somehow more violent, because when the fighting ended, the island itself became the enemy. Coral was strong but brittle. It cut boots, it dulled blades, it broke tool teeth, and there was so much of it, miles and miles of reef crust and ancient rock raised by volcanic memory. A Seabee officer stood on a ridge, looked over the island, and said, "We're not building an airfield, we're flattening a world." He wasn't being dramatic, he was reporting. In Kansas, Collins had once cut earth with a reblato and horse-drawn plough. Here, his invention and the men who grew up on the same kind of soil now bent geology to military necessity. They blasted coral with dynamite until the ground shook like a living heartbeat. They carved hills with bulldozers until cliffs turned to steps and then to flat pads. They hauled rock, crushed fine as flour in trucks that moved in endless lines, headlights glowing at night like fireflies marching to war. Everywhere, steel teeth hit stone. Everywhere, engines roared. Everywhere, sweat fell like rain no storm cloud had delivered. 4 runways 8,000 feet each, taxiways longer than entire European strips, fuel farms large enough to drink a river dry, hangars like grand cathedrals built for giants. The men worked in shifts that ignored clocks. Day and night ceased to matter. There was only before runway and after runway. A chaplain once asked a Seabee, "When do you rest?" The man kept hammering while answering, "When? The war's done." By autumn, the first B-29s arrived. They came in pairs at first, then in formations, then in flocks that filled the sky like migrating metal birds. Their wings stretched wider than the shoulders of any aircraft the world had known. Their propellers carved the air with the strength of storm gods. Their bellies carried fuel in rivers and bombs in tides. They touched Tinian's coral runways with wheels that hissed and smoked and left black streaks across white ground. To some men, it looked like the sky was finally learning to use its full lungs. For pilots, the sight was reassurance. For the Japanese, it was omen. For the Seabees, it was simply proof of purpose. One mechanic wiped his face, squinted at the glittering bombers, and muttered, "We built a city just so those birds could roost." Another corrected him. "Not just roost. Hunt." General Curtis LeMay soon arrived, brisk, blunt, eyes like steel rivets. He looked at the island the way a carpenter looks at a blueprint, or a butcher looks at a carcass, not with reverence, but with calculation. He traced lines on a board: Japan, Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya. Cities not yet ash, but soon to be. We hit them until they can't stand up, then we hit them again. His breath was smoke, not from cigarettes, from engines in his memory. And behind him, rows of B-29 pilots listened like men attending a sermon delivered by a prophet whose god was fire and logistics. But the miracle of Tinian wasn't the generals. It wasn't even the planes. It was the pipes buried under coral, pumping aviation fuel from floating tank farms out in the lagoon. It was the storage depots stacked like horizon-breaking mountains of crates. It was the machine shops cutting spare parts from raw metal. It was the cooling pits for bombs, shaded and guarded as though they were relics, because in a way, they were. It was the fact that from this island, warplanes could strike Tokyo daily, as casually as mail trucks leaving a depot. Air supremacy didn't happen in the sky. It happened on the ground, in the sweat, in the planning, in the pipes and steel and coral. A Japanese naval officer, interrogated after war's end, shook his head slowly when asked when he realized Japan would lose. When we learned you built cities for your planes on islands without water. Then, softer, you turned ocean into America. Near Christmas, 1944, a Seabee stood beside a runway, boots powdered white by coral dust. Planes thundered overhead wave after wave, engines beating the air like war drums. A chaplain beside him said, "Think the enemy knows what's coming?" The Seabee didn't answer. He spat, rolled his shoulders, and pulled a wrench from his belt. The chaplain tried again. "When this is over, what will you tell your children you did in the war?" The man tightened a bolt, wiped his brow, and finally replied, "I made." And sure, the sky had a flaw. Above them, bombers kept rising. Below them, coral lay flat and obedient. And across the ocean, a nation braced for a firestorm that had begun not in the clouds but in the soil. The Pacific War was now a runway stretching all the way to Japan, and every mile of it had been built, not gifted. In the end, the sky did not win the war. The ground handed it the ladder,